You know that moment when everyone's pulling out their phones to capture the sunset, and there's one person just watching it with their actual eyes? That person who says, "I'm not on social media," and suddenly the whole room looks at them like they just confessed to living off the grid in a cave. Yeah, that person isn't a technophobe or a hermit, and they're definitely not out of touch. They might actually be protecting something most of us have already lost without even realizing it. If you're someone who genuinely has zero interest in scrolling through Instagram at 2 a.m., who doesn't feel the urge to document your coffee or share your thoughts with strangers, you're about to understand why your brain works differently from the billions of people currently glued to their screens. Because here's what nobody tells you. In today's world, not using social media isn't normal anymore. It's a quiet form of rebellion. And neuroscience is starting to uncover something fascinating about people who choose that path. Their brains might be wired in a way that resists something the rest of us fell into without even questioning it. Now let's start with the obvious question. Why does everyone else care so much? Why does it feel almost impossible to stay away? Social media taps directly into one of the most primitive systems in your brain, the need for social validation. When you post something and get likes, comments, or shares, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical that drives craving, pleasure, and reward, the same system that responds to food, intimacy, achievement, and even addiction. And here's the part most people don't realize. These platforms weren't created by accident. They were engineered by teams who study behavioral psychology to make them as engaging and addictive as possible. Every notification, every scroll, every refresh is designed to keep you coming back. But this is where people who don't use social media become interesting. They're not immune to dopamine, they're just getting it somewhere else. Research shows that their reward systems are less triggered by external validation and more activated by internal satisfaction, which means they don't need approval from strangers to feel like their life has value. They don't need an audience to confirm that their experiences matter. The experience itself is enough. Psychologists call this intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Most people are operating on extrinsic rewards, likes, attention, recognition. But people who step away from social media have learned how to generate intrinsic reward. They validate themselves, and once you can do that, the entire system loses its power over you. But let's go deeper, because there's another layer most people don't talk about. Social media isn't just about connection, it's about comparison. Every time you scroll, your brain is subconsciously measuring your life against everyone else's highlight reel. And you always lose that comparison because you're comparing your unfiltered reality to someone else's edited, curated, perfectly framed version of life. You're seeing their best moments stacked against your average ones. And over time, that shifts how you see yourself. There was a study that showed limiting social media use significantly reduced feelings of anxiety and depression. But what's even more interesting is that people who don't use it at all tend to report even higher levels of life satisfaction. Not because their lives are objectively better, but because they're not constantly being reminded of what they don't have. They stepped out of a game that was designed for them to feel like they're always behind. And when you're not playing a game you can't win, something changes. You relax. You stop measuring. You start existing again. Now think about attention for a second. Social media trains your brain to crave novelty every few seconds. Scroll, new content. Scroll, new content. Another hit, another distraction, another micro reward. Over time, your brain adapts to that pattern. It becomes harder to focus, harder to sit still, harder to stay with one thought. But people who don't use social media develop a completely different relationship with attention. They can sit with an idea longer. They can read without interruption. They can think without needing stimulation every few seconds. There's even research showing differences in brain activity. Heavy users tend to show reduced engagement in areas responsible for focus and impulse control, while people who limit or avoid it maintain stronger attention regulation. In simple terms, one group is constantly reacting, the other is choosing where their attention goes. But let's be honest for a moment, because this is important. Not everyone who avoids social media is doing it from a place of clarity. Some people are avoiding it because they're afraid of being judged, of being seen, of being evaluated. That's not the same thing. That's not freedom, that's protection. So the real question isn't just whether you use social media or not, it's why. Are you stepping away because it doesn't serve you, or because you're hiding from something? Because one is empowerment and the other is fear wearing a smarter mask. But for the people who genuinely choose not to engage, something else is happening. They've realized that social media isn't actually social, it's performance. Every post is a curated version of yourself. Every caption is filtered. Every moment is framed for perception. It's not connection, it's presentation. And they've looked at that system and said, this isn't real. Real connection doesn't happen through a screen. It happens in presence, in conversation, in moments that aren't captured, edited, or shared. It happens in the silence between words, in the imperfections, in the parts that don't look good on camera but feel real in memory. And here's something most people don't expect. People who don't use social media often have fewer relationships but deeper ones. Because they're not spreading their attention across hundreds of shallow connections, they're investing it in a few meaningful ones. They're not maintaining visibility, they're building closeness. Quality over quantity, depth over reach. And there's also a time factor that most people ignore. The average person spends hours every day on social media. That adds up to weeks of time every year. Entire chunks of life spent consuming other people's experiences instead of creating your own. But people who step away get that time back. And what they do with it is interesting. They think more, they create more, they rest more. They exist without feeling like they need to document that existence. There's a concept called continuous partial attention, where you're never fully present because your mind is always split between what you're doing and what might happen next on your phone. You're physically in one place, mentally in another. But people who don't use social media escape that pattern. When they're with someone, they're actually there, not checking, not waiting, not dividing their awareness, just present. And somehow, that has become rare. But society treats these people like they're the strange ones, like they're missing out, like they're disconnected, when in reality, they might be more connected than anyone else in the room, because they're not filtering life through a screen, they're experiencing it directly. There's also a creativity angle that's hard to ignore. People who step away from social media often report that their thinking becomes clearer, their ideas deeper, their work more original. Because they're no longer creating for an algorithm, they're creating for themselves. They're not chasing engagement, they're expressing something real. Social media quietly turns everyone into a performer, a brand, a curated identity. But when you step away from that, you return to something simpler. You're not a product, you're just a person. And there's a kind of freedom in that that most people have forgotten exists. Now let's talk about something everyone feels but rarely questions. FOMO, the fear of missing out. It's one of the biggest reasons people stay on social media, even when they don't enjoy it. The fear that something important is happening without them. But here's what people who don't use social media have realized. Most of what you're afraid of missing isn't actually meaningful. It's noise. It's updates, highlights, fragments of other people's lives that don't change yours. And the things that do matter, the real connections, the important moments, those don't depend on an app. They find you anyway. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Social media is not neutral. It's designed to keep you engaged. And one of the most effective ways to do that is by making you feel like you're not enough. Not successful enough, not attractive enough, not interesting enough. Because that feeling keeps you coming back, trying to fix it, trying to prove something. But people who step away remove themselves from that loop entirely. And when you're not constantly being told you're lacking, something shifts. You start to feel like you're enough, as you are, without needing to prove it. And that changes everything. There's also something subtle but important about memory. When you experience something directly, without trying to capture it, your brain encodes it differently, more deeply, more vividly. But when you're focused on documenting, framing, sharing, your attention splits. You're not fully there. You're performing the moment instead of living it. People who don't use social media are building memories, not content. And over time, that creates a very different kind of life. Now, this isn't about rejecting technology entirely. Social media is a tool, and like any tool, its value depends on how it's used. But the real question is, are you using it, or is it using you? Are you choosing to engage, or are you reacting automatically? People who don't use social media have simply answered that question honestly, and their answer was no. They chose to keep their attention, their time, their mental space. And in a world that constantly competes for those things, that choice matters. But this isn't about judgment. If social media adds something meaningful to your life, that's valid. Just be honest with yourself about what it's actually giving you and what it's taking in return. Because attention is not a small thing. It's your life, moment by moment, and where you place it shapes everything. So if you're someone who doesn't use social media or feels disconnected from it, just know this: you're not weird, you're not missing out. You might actually be seeing something more clearly than most. You're choosing presence over performance, depth over visibility, experience over documentation. And in a world where almost everyone is broadcasting their life, that might be the most authentic thing you can do. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. I would genuinely appreciate your support.